Liberal-fascism.com.
I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The Republican Party, the most successful third party in the history of democracy here in the 21st century, has an ideological divide that doesn't have one name or two names. It's about the roots of the party, which reach much farther back than the Civil War, that is the predicate for the Republican foundation, Abraham Lincoln being the first Republican president elected to the White House. It reaches back to the Revolutionary period, the founding period, not on this side of the Atlantic, but a man named Edmund Burke. And in the 20th century, a man who updated Edmund Burke and is admired by many conservatives who are in the Republican Party, Russell Kirk, writing about these two figures from the 18th century. Edmund Burke, an opponent of the regime at that time that conducted a destructive war against the colonies. This is prior to America becoming an independent republic. And Russell Kirk. Both these men are at the center of a debate, a colloquy held in public, writing correspondence by David Brooks of the New York Times, a well-known Republican commentator, and Richard Epstein, who is not a Republican commentator. He is a libertarian of the Hoover Institution. Nonetheless, libertarians and Republicans are ships that sail together often. Richard, a very good evening to you. I hope I have caged this correctly for you to plunge immediately into your reluctance to embrace the David Brooks, Edmund Burke version of the Republican Party, the accommodationist, cooperation-only Republican Party. A very good evening to you.
Very good evening. Look, it's really complicated on this because essentially politics always has 2 points. The first point is to try to figure out as a matter of principle in what direction you wish to go and why. And then the second question is the more pragmatic one, given the fact that you do not have a dictatorship of the righteous, i.e. yourself and your friends, which compromises along the way do you make in order to achieve what you think to be the best balance? And the first task is one of deep principle, and the second one is one of accommodation. And, you know, my relative comparative advantage in all of this stuff is dealing on first principles. My knowledge of the situation sense in any particular case, where you give in order to get, is something I don't have. I don't disparage that kind of thing, and in fact believe that coalitions of sort of uneasy alliances are the necessary predicates for winning an election, but I do it on the first stuff. So let me talk a little bit about, John, if this is okay with you, first the principled end of this thing, and then talk about the compromise end of this.
Correct.
Okay. Well, on the principled end of the things, I've always been completely uninfluenced and unimpressed by the general methodology associated with the conservatives. And Russell Kirk is one such person. Leo Strauss, who is a famous philosopher of politics and so forth at the University of Chicago, was another. Brooks, a University of Chicago graduate, clearly underneath that sort of influence, is, of course, a third. And what troubles me about them is they are very suspicious of systematic theoretical thought as giving you any insight as to the way in which the world ought to work. Everything starts off with a series of deeply held institutions which are not really contestable in their minds by people who disagree with them, and then a series of marginal adjustments based upon direct observation put together with some degree of hunch. And there's no question, if you know where you're going and you have a clear course, those sorts of mid-course corrections are extremely important and can often be done for a great deal of help. But there are no first principles in conservative thought. There's a series of custom which says we ought to respect where we are but doesn't explain how we got there or why we ought to do this. I'm much more of a kind of a libertarian social theorist. And to me, the real questions are 2. First is, what do we think to be the essential nature of human beings? And then, what are the basic principles, given their nature, that tend to work best in organizing them? And on the first point, the basic double principle is, as I mentioned in this critique of Brooks, is there's a combination of scarcity and self-interest, where scarcity drives people to be self-interested because if there's not enough to go around and you're exceedingly generous, the more egotistical people will always take something from you. Well, on the other hand, if self-interest is simply defined as interest in one's person, you'll never get marriage, you'll never get children, you'll never get continuity across the generations. So self-interest is what the biologists call inclusive fitness. You must make, in fact, conduct which benefits not only you, but your spouse and your entire gene line. And this necessarily requires a certain degree of custom and sociability of the sort that the various traditional forms of conservatives like. And it also points out, ironically, that the original kinds of human interactions, as they say correctly, are not those of the marketplace, but of those of these kind of voluntary interactions between people in small and close communities. But the second point is, this method works only for small communities with very close genetic connections. It does it for a family. It may do it for a clan, but it won't do it for a society. Now, for societies, what you have to do is to get principles of voluntary exchange backed up by strong rules of property, which prohibit various forms of aggression. So the basic grand principle is aggression, no; cooperation, yes. And it's not 100% correct, but that gets you a very long way down to where you want to go. And so from that, you can then derive a system of markets, and you can divide a prohibition against the use of force. And the tricky point comes on how it is that you use force in order to prevent the abuse of force by having a system of taxation and public enforcement. And that makes you, I think, as a serious person, something in the Lockean tradition. And what you fear is massive redistribution through government, because that has the same effect in many ways as an extensive program of private aggression. They're not exactly parallel, but they're close enough. So I think if you understand all of this stuff, then custom, which they like, turns out to be a way in which people enter into repetitive transactions, because by trial and error, what they do is they find out those kinds of solutions that work the best. And they even develop customs to deal with situations of rapid change. You call them meta-customs. So how it is that a company does venture capital work and so forth. And the model is, I think, pretty solid, but it's much more coherent than the conservatives who simply announce that their timeless principles but don't tell you what they are.
Let me run through quickly what you find to be the four weaknesses of the Brooksian, Burkean system of custom triumphing over marketplace solutions, contract-based. One is that they're vague about what natural law or custom is, the timeless content. It's more poetic than it is detailed. Another is that what we have here is that they're depending on evolution, which is itself a presumption and imperfect, you call it. A third weakness with the program is that self-interest in evolution does not reward the individual. It awards what you call the clan, the larger family unit. And fourth, we have to recognize that there is such a thing as a genetic line that is blessed by the accident of history. We can't rule that out unless, of course, you have some collective need to go to the bottom in order to make things fair-minded. I think we can rule that out, but the conservatives are not thorough-minded about all of this when they worship custom and tradition. Is that a fair summary of the four weaknesses of Mr. Brooks?
I think it captures it. Let me put it this way. I do believe that the conservatives sort of understand that evolution kind of matters, but what they aren't is systematic in including it. And with respect to custom, I think they don't understand both its weaknesses and its strengths, because in many cases the only way that custom will work is if, in fact, it becomes the custom of the marketplace rather than the custom of the family. And so that custom, therefore, is designed to influence voluntary exchanges. So the key feature to understand about this is when they talk about markets, they seem to think that it's only exchanges of goods and services in a commercial arrangement. I talk about them in a more comprehensive fashion as any sort of voluntary cooperative effort, whether it's after financial gain or social gain by way of religious organizations, amusement, and all the rest of it. And so there's not that strong opposition between the market and the custom in the way in which they put it. Essentially, sound markets accommodate all sorts of voluntarist arrangements, and the purpose of the legal system is to make sure that these things can be nourished and protected, which means that when folks are excluded, they can't scream, and the only exception to that are common carriers, where there's only one railroad that gets you from London to Oxford in 1820, they have to take all comers, but that's not a social arrangement. That's having people sit next to each other in a car. It's not like a club or something of the sort. So I don't think they quite get this, and so they get too suspicious of people in this case for the following reason. Much of the objection of the conservative Republicans is that government has essentially snuffed out custom. And I think that, as I try to point out, is if you're trying to run a voluntary organization and the federal government tells you who you have to admit and whom you can't exclude, if you can't choose your memberships, you can't choose your norms. And so the real threat to these organizations is not markets. Markets actually support this kind of stuff. It's government regulation that essentially tells you whom you have to associate, the anti-discrimination laws, the required labor laws, and all the rest of that stuff. So I think they're also, in that point, looking in the wrong place. So on the normative side, what one wants to do is to stress not that rich people want to get richer, but to stress the whole set of social institutions that can be created where those people of good fortune understand that it's important to organize themselves to take care of those who are less blessed than themselves. And the long tradition of laissez-faire is the tradition which started the great charitable hospitals and the great charitable universities in the United States. And to call this social Darwinism, red in tooth and claw, is a very different position. The social Darwinists essentially would prohibit charity on the grounds that it preserves the position of the poor and those unable to turk themselves, whereas laissez-faire, in effect, was quite sympathetic to the point because it realized that many people were down on their luck because of misfortunes over which they could not control, or in some cases they basically did bad behaviors, but they were subject to improvement through moral coaching, religious suasion, and the like. So I think that the compatibility between the thoughtful libertarian market-based system and that of a conservative system is greater, so that I criticize David Brooks in part for not understanding how the two systems can cohere, because he tends to be, I think, less than systematic in understanding how first principles and social contract
Richard, I want to put this into action next, because we have a Republican Party right now in debate with a candidate, Mitt Romney, who illustrates in various ways the market-based, which is his business status, and also elements of the conservatism that Russell Kirk and Edmund Burke would celebrate, the need or the urge to cooperate and accommodate. Richard Epstein is a professor of law at New York University, as well as a senior lecturer in law at the University of Chicago. He is, most importantly, writing for Defining Ideas at the Hoover Institution. Peter and Kirsten Bedford, senior fellow of the Hoover Institution and a member of the Property Rights, Freedom, and Prosperity Task Force. When we come back, for you wondering about the Republican Party and why it is so fierce in its contest with itself, why it always seems to be constantly in a state of civil turmoil, we'll turn to Mr. Romney, who combines the turmoil in his candidacy. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.
Liberal-fascism.com